Hello everyone, welcome to another video of the British Championship Qualifiers. This was my fourth round out of 5. I was on a perfect score of 3 out of 3 points, and I think that with a win I was almost guaranteed to qualify with a round to spare, if I won. If I drew, I'd probably have to at least draw, but probably win the last game to make sure I got through on tie breaks and all the rest. And this might be my toughest opponent so far. Their English rating is about 2200, but the FIDE rating is only in the 1900s. In this game, as white, I started off with knight f3, and then f5 was played, c4, knight f6, and knight c3. So black's employing a Dutch defence. It's still up in the air how they proceed. They could try a stone wall with e6, d5, and all their pawns are on the white squares. They could fianchetto with g6, bishop g7, and there's a few other ways that black can play this. In the game they chose g6, and I played d3. d4 is going into the main line Dutch, but d3 has some independent value. The most important part of it is that it allows a very quick e4. Black normally has the e4 square under an iron grip. So with my d3 followed by e4, employing a light square strategy, I can break some of the hold black has over the centre of the board. If black takes me, I'll take with the d-pawn. I'm fairly comfortable with this type of position. It's almost like a Maroczy bind. And with d6, I missed the best move here because I hadn't anticipated d6 for some reason. I hadn't really prepped for this game. So I was trying to throw my opponent off from what they usually do. And I played bishop e2, but if I take, black will take with their bishop, I think. And then, strangely enough, moving my d-pawn twice is not bad here, because their f5 pawn has vanished, so they can't control e4 as much. And with castling, I can follow up with bishop d3, controlling the e4 square. And with the trade, white has a pleasant advantage. I'll still have to play on a lot more moves. It's not by no means over, but I definitely am not fretting too much here. Instead, I chose a slightly weaker move. I chose bishop e2, and the plan was to have the bishop and queen both lined up on g4 and h5. So after black castles, I then shove h4, trying to play h5 and blast apart the king position for black. They played h6, which then scuppers my idea of playing h5, because black could then push their g-pawn, and I can't open up the position. So at this point I try to make use of the fact their g6 pawn is now weak, with the move e5, and if takes, I'll take with the knight, and I'm hitting g6. If black plays a natural defensive move, I can now play h5. If black opens it up with pawn takes, I'm very happy with this. And if g5, I know that I can always play knight g6 if I need to in the future. But for now I might settle with d4. And again, I like my position a lot more than I like black's. In the game though, they chose a good move, similar to ideas seen in the King's Indian defence, with knight g4, attacking my pawn 3 times. I don't really want to trade on d6 because that will remove any chance of an advantage I will have. Black can simply recapture and they will have greater development of their pieces. So with the move d4, I'm setting up the challenge, and black did not shy away. If knight c6, developing a piece, pressurizing e5 even more, I can push to e6, which is what I had hoped would happen in the game. If black grabs the pawn, they will fall to the tactic with a fork d5. So instead, they played takes, and I recaptured with my knight. Again, almost forcing another trade of pieces, to be honest, which I felt was necessary because black was more active with their pieces than I was. And after knight takes, pawn takes, the important point is that when the queens come off, which my opponent forced, my e5 pawn is weak, but then their h6 pawn is weak. So with the bishop takes pawn, I will take on h6, attacking their rook. And I'd thought that if black doesn't take me, my pawn can move to f4, and then I lock up their bishop on g7, where it can't really be useful in the game. But he found a very good move with bishop e6, and I wasn't totally sure how to defend this. Pawn b3 feels very, very weird, because my knight and rook on the long diagonal from their g7 bishop are now vulnerable. So that looks doomed to fail. And bishop e2 maybe is correct, but then I felt I wasn't being active enough. I tried knight d5 with the intention of letting black win a pawn, but my bishop pair in an open position like this should give me compensation, and black does still have weaknesses all over the board. They did take, and I took back. Bishop takes, and then bishop h6, going for the very active lines that will follow. I had anticipated bishop takes pawn, where it's a temporary pawn sacrifice because my rook attacks the two things on the b file, the pawn and the bishop. And after a check to save the pawn, they have to save their rook and save the b7 pawn, and they can't do both. So rook d8, I would then take, and if black takes, what would white play to get an overwhelming advantage? So the move will be, if rook takes pawn, that's a very big mistake because of bishop b3, where I am pinning the rook to the king, winning the exchange. So I had thought maybe knight a6 would be played to develop and defend c7, and then I can lift my rook up and it's liberated from its sort of prison on h1. Bishop back to g7. I could trade, and then I have a slight advantage like this, and then rook e3. I could also drop my bishop back as well, and I still think white has a slight edge in the position. So that did not happen, but I thought I would have at least equality when I'd seen all this stuff. It's hard to visualize sort of 4 or 5 moves ahead. But again, the bishop pair and black's sort of bad pawn structure made me believe I would not be horribly wrong to do this. And after I did bishop takes h6, black instead played rook d8. So again, my pawn is not really vulnerable yet because of bishop b3. But instead I played bishop f3, lining up with their other rook, thinking maybe I could sort of trick them into playing something bad, then I can go d6. And again, if bishop takes pawn, I would have the same type of position as earlier with rook b1. So instead they did knight d7 to develop the knight. I am allowed to castle still, I haven't moved my king all game. Castling queenside improves my king in that it defends the pawn, and it connects my rooks, and my rook on the d file is protecting my pawn. So I think it was the optimal move. Then I had thought maybe bishop f6 would be played, but my reasoning was wrong. I thought the main reason for this was to allow knight to e5, but the computer sees that if I play h5, black goes g5, and my bishop on h6 is trapped. So I had planned to do this, if bishop f6, and I hadn't really even seen this h5 g5 plan. I just thought that maybe I can maneuver my bishop around. Knight e5, bishop e2, this was as far as I could see, and it still, to me, looked okay, but according to the computer, black is more or less equal after rook d7 trying to line up the rooks to attack my d-pawn. So that's how black could have essentially got equality, but instead they chose a5, and my opponent is attempting to play rook a6 and maybe rook b6 to attack the b2 pawn. So apparently h5 is strongest, but I did not like this move that much because of rook a6, and apparently d6 is the move which keeps white with an advantage, which I did not see. This move is very nice because it interrupts the defense of the g6 pawn from black's rook. And after they capture, I can trade rooks. then take the pawn, and this gives white a small edge as the g6 pawn can become dangerous, and I still have the two bishops, and I'm attacking b7 as well. So there's lots of pluses here for white. I had not evaluated this correctly, because I believed that d6 didn't really even occur to me. I believed I had to keep the d6 pawn to minimise the damage black could do if they shoved their pawns up the board. So I felt it was necessary to keep that pawn on the board, which I was wrong about. Instead I played g4, thinking maybe I could open the g-file with pawn takes pawn. That happened, so rook a6, and I traded pawns. My bishop is now attacked, and I improved it, also preventing knight c5 and rook b6. So I still felt this was good for me. And again, bishop f6 is the best move, but king h7 was played. And then I sort of got very fortunate here. I played bishop e2, and the plan was to force the rook moving, so he moved it to f6. And then I had thought bishop d3 gave me a clear advantage, because it's lined up with the king. I'm now ready to start attacking on the h and g files with the rooks. What I had missed was knight b6, which was an excellent move, and my pawn on d5 will drop. So, unfortunately, if I'm dropping the pawn with not really that much initiative to make up for it, I can't claim any advantage. And if I take their knight, they could take with their pawn if they want to, and it's opposite-coloured bishops, so I'm not sure I can win that either. What move did I play to try and trick my opponent and make the game very complicated? The move I played was d6, so I found it this time. Here, black is in real trouble if they don't find the right move. In the game, he did not find the right option. He can take that pawn with, I believe, 5 different pieces. 2 pawns, the bishop, and 2 rooks. But 4 of the captures will lead to disasters. Actually, no, 3 of them lead to disasters. 1 of them is sort of okay. And then 1 of them is just, like, better for black. The best move is bishop takes here on d6. And my best plan of action, which I had been planning, was bishop g5, then rook to e1, and then infiltration on e6. And I had thought that maybe this was enough to at least have equality in this line. My h-pawn shoving up the board can be dangerous. And if rook h8, I can play rook g1, and the computer finds the very nice king f8, which is completely equal, assuming we both play the right moves. So d6 was not the worst plan in the world for me to do. Instead, black played a move which was not as accurate. They played rook takes, which this rook move and the 2 pawn captures allow me to play f4, trapping their bishop. You may think that bishop to d4 is okay for black because it's defended, but can you see my really strong response, which should win the game? I can win at least the exchange. Bishop takes bishop. If black doesn't take, I'm simply winning, so they have to take. And then I can win back my pawn that I lost earlier with on d6, but also I win the exchange. It's check, and once they take my bishop, I will grab the other rook. So I'm now clearly better in this position. Instead, black chose the only other move they could do to save the bishop, which was rook c6 check. I get out of check, and then bishop d6. They have saved the bishop, but unfortunately they have another piece which is devoid of squares. Bishop b5 traps the rook. It turns out the best move is rook c5, and this only gives me about half a pawn or a third of a pawn's advantage, because it's a pawn and the exchange that black is getting. So, pawn and bishop, or pawn and knight against rook, is not It's not an overwhelming victory for the rook. It will still be difficult for me to grind the win. But instead they chose bishop c5, which to me is inaccurate, because once I take the rook and they grab the bishop, it's still a pawn for and the exchange, or a pawn for the exchange. But then rook to e1, and black now has to either take my bishop with their rook, and I take their bishop, and the knight is not going to be very good in this ending, because there's activity on both sides of the board, the king side and the queen side. And knights are only really amazing when all the activity is restrained to one portion of the board. Ideally one quadrant, but 2 quadrants next to each other is not too bad either. So here they tried bishop f4, but then they've got 2 pawns for the exchange, but I win both of them back straight away. The rook takes check, bishop takes pawn. All I have to do here is try to trade off enough pieces that my rook should overpower their minor piece. Bishop d6, anchoring the bishop, very good move. Rook e8 is my response. Rook g6, trying to maybe shepherd the king and the pawn up the board. So king h5, king takes h4, and then f4, f3, pushing the pawn. So my move, bishop f3, will block the pawn and also prevent the king moving up. Knight c4 to maybe have some cheapos if I play rook to f1. Knight d2 check would win my bishop at least. So bishop d5, knight e4, e5, and then here I had a way to trade the rooks. Can you see how I can force off one pair of rooks? Actually, there's probably a better way of doing it. Bishop e6, rook e6 might be better than the move I played, actually. I played the more fancy rook h8, king has to drop back, and then rook g8, and trade. So I was expecting king takes, I'd somehow missed the knight capturing, and then I had to be a bit careful. So here I did a move that doesn't look careful at all. I played h5. And the plan is, if king takes h5, winning a pawn, this I think will doom black, because now I force off the last pair of minor pieces that will come off. And from now I can target black's isolated pawns. So I'll go for one of them. Black can try, say, trading pawns or making my pawns look silly, doubled up on the a file. And then their last chance is to push the remaining passed pawn, which is far away from my king. But with accurate play, I should be able to get the rook and king over in time. So for example, rook f5, and then king e2. So the pawn will never promote. And then with just a little bit of good technique, I will win a pawn here. Because if black pushes the c-pawn up, I can push a6, a7, becoming a queen, or black will give up the bishop for it. And if black goes bishop to e5, I can push a6, a7, again, pushing the pawn to becoming a queen. So the best move is king g4, I can grab the pawn, and black can resign here. a6, a7 is coming. There's not really much black can do about it. So that, even though I lost the pawn with h5, that was the plan. But instead, black found a resourceful counter to my plan. They did not capture it. They played knight to e5, dominating the board with the knight. I now defended my pawn. And black started to shove the f-pawn up. So if I'm not careful and that pawn gets to f2, it could be very awkward with 2 minor pieces against my rook and bishop. So I prevent f3 by having bishop and rook control that square. Knight g4, bishop f3, blockading the pawn, and defending my h-pawn at the same time. So the rest of the moves for the next few turns are simply shuffling around, and my king starts to become active. So both pawns go on light squares, no chance for black to win any of them. And then I start to move the king up, improving my pieces. Here, possibly b4 is correct for me, avoiding a lot of the pawns coming off. Because if all the pawns were traded, I don't think I can win this. So the more pawns are on, the better. but instead I felt like my king was more important to improve. Black manages to get one pair of the pawns off, and if the B and C pawns vanished, it might be a draw. So I had to be very wary of losing my B pawn. And here I was now in a bit of a quandary, because I've got all king, pawns, rooks and bishops on light squares, and with black's next move, their knight can fork a lot of them. So if I play a careless move like king to f5, black's knight e5 is actually very likely to draw. I can't save bishop and rook together. The computer, of course, finds the absolutely ridiculous move, taking the bishop, and then I'm somehow able to win in this line, because the thing to note is that my h-pawn, its promotion square, where it will turn into a queen, is a different colour to the bishop's control. On h8, my bishop cannot get to that square. And with pawns on the edge of the board, on a and h, if it's just king, bishop and that particular pawn against a king, it's a draw if their king can get to the corner. So I have to keep my b-pawn on the board. And that takes a lot of manoeuvring around, trying to force the knight away so that I can push my b-pawn. So I'm willing to give up the h-pawn to force the knight away, but then they have this move, d5, and if I take it, then knight c3 forks bishop and king. And I'm not going to really talk much about this position, but I'll show the moves if you're curious, because this is so complicated. It will take me a very long time to work out all this stuff. And there's no reason for me to go into an ending this fiddly if I want a simple win. So I will eventually force the knight to where it cannot get closer to the pawn, because the bishop and king dominate the knight. And now it's winning. So instead of playing a line that takes about 20 moves to win with perfect play, I thought that I should maybe play a bit more carefully and played bishop d1. So now there's no forks on my king and pawns. So knight f6, knight c5 don't work because my bishop is guarding both pawns. There's no fork either on the king and rook because they're two squares diagonally away, and a knight can never fork two pieces in that setup. So knight c5 was played, king f5 now, f3, very clever move. And the computer says I can actually take this pawn, which I had not even really considered during the game. Or if I had, it was just to very briefly look at it, then dismiss it. Because if takes, I lose the b-pawn. And now it's very, very difficult to win. I would have to use my king, rook and pawn all together to threaten checkmates and things to force the king out of the corner. And the line given is something like this, where the black knight is dominated, so it can't get closer to my king with a check. And then I can threaten the knight. So if knight g5, I can. I thought I could take it, but apparently not. King f8, and then now I can eventually win with this sort of slow improvement of my king and bishops. So this is winning apparently. But again, I would not be able to play this accurately in a game. Instead, I thought I chose a better move, to be honest. I'm sure it wins quicker than this computer line. After f3, I played rook f6, so that my king can move out the way and get the pawn. f2, and then king g4 is very important. The king had no other good square. If king to g5, then knight e4 would fork the rook and the king, and I would lose. So king g4, and unfortunately my opponent played the wrong move here. Knight to e4 is a move I had briefly looked at before he played the wrong move. Then bishop c2, king to g6, and surprisingly I have to play rook f3 and not take the knight. Now their knight is forced back. King g5, there are no more good checks. So bishop e7 threatening discoveries. and then I can force them back and play king f5, where now the knight cannot guard the f pawn, and the bishop can't guard the pawn because I take the knight. So I will win the key pawn, and if knight g8, I can now take it, and this is winning because the b pawn is the one I needed to keep on the board. So here their knight actually is very low on squares, so I can now threaten checkmates on e8 with my rook, and there's not really a good way for black to prevent all this. So instead, the game move that finished the match was knight d3 instead. I think the goal was to go for knight to e5 check, but unfortunately my pin now is completely winning, because even if king g7 like before to counterattack on my rook, I can let my rook leave the f-file, because after their king moves, doesn't matter where it goes, then I can take the knight, and I'm also protecting f1, or controlling f1, so the pawn cannot promote, and a piece up I'll win this. So very tense match, a lot of slow manoeuvring in the later part of the game, but in the beginning it was all about sort of initiative and attack, where I sort of failed to really go for amazing attack, but I was able to put my opponent under enough pressure that they ended up giving me the exchange. So I thought I played that sort of okay, but I wasn't amazed at my performance. There were definitely moves where I could have improved better than the game positions. Anyway, on to the last round, which will be in about 2.5 hours, and I will try to upload before midnight tonight. If I can draw the final match, I will definitely qualify for the main British Championship. If I lose, there's a very high chance I will qualify, but there's like a very, very small chance that on some kind of tie break I would be eliminated. And if I win, I'll just win the tournament, or the qualifying stage, which wasn't really the goal coming in here. It was mostly just qualifying. So hope you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. Bye.